And we're live.
We are live, and welcome to all, and thank you for joining our session. My name's Laura Bartolo. I'm at Northwestern University, and we have a full session. I am going to now send through chat a Google Docs link, and where you can sign in with your name, institution, and email if you so wish, and we encourage you to do so. Let me run through the agenda very quickly before handing it off to our speakers. We are going to have an update on the International Materials Resource Registry Working Group by Ray Plant. That will be followed by an update also on the research data format by Bob Hainish. And then we'll move into a presentation by Dave Elbert from Johns Hopkins University on the Materials Research Data Alliance annual meeting and their infrastructure provider survey. And then finally, we'll have a session that is joint with Alicia, Matt, and Adam on delivery platforms for open marketplaces. Throughout these presentations, I encourage you to use the chat to add any questions that you might have for the speakers, and we'll relay that to them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ray Plant to talk about the International Materials Resource Registry. Thanks, Ray.
I'll start with a quick question. Should we use maybe the Q&A for questions, or do you want to keep everything on the chat?
I think it would be better to do it in the, oh, go ahead, Bridget. What would you advise?
Yeah, that's what I'd said previously. It's best to, if you put the questions in the Q&A, and then the chat is for the chat, for the hellos and the how are yous, and okay.
So ignore what I had said previously.
Let's see, we have people still joining.
And see your slide.
So it seems the tradition is that if you can see my slides, you can give me an emoticon of some sort. Okay, fantastic. All right. So this is going to be brief, so we can get on to other discussions. But we'd like to keep you informed of continued things happening around the work that was done in our International Materials Resource Registries Working Group, which is now closed for some time. Its aim was to build and demonstrate a federation of data resource registries for finding material science resources. These are things like collections, databases, websites, tools, software, even semantic assets like vocabularies and such like that. So the idea was to provide a platform where we could collect these descriptions of these things and then make those descriptions searchable so that you could find any data resource that's relevant for material science that's available in the world. That was the goal, and we completed that. And included in one of the things that we did was we had to develop a resource description schema, which is based in XML, and incorporated into that is a material science vocabulary, which covers sort of the topics, materials, techniques that could be used and are relevant to the data resource that you're discovering. So you can discover based on those attributes. So that's just a quick reminder of what it is we did. And we created a final report, and it had a very, admittedly, very slow evolutionary tale as it approached submission to the tab. We did that last fall, and we got some initial feedback from them that expressed some concern about international representation in the author list. And it was clear that they had a good point there. And so we reached out to the working group for additional authors who could be added to the list so that to reflect the international endorsement of the work and participation in the effort. And so I wanted to thank Brian, Asahiko, and Raphael for being willing to add their names to the author list. And so immediately after the session, I'll be resubmitting this to the tab. So that's the status on that report. There are ongoing activities related to the registry that I like to keep you informed about. Right now, we have 2 operating nodes of the registry, one at NIST, one at the Materials Data Facility. And we continue to talk to folks about additional new deployments into this federation. The idea is that we could have multiple registries throughout the world that are adding new descriptions of resources into the registry, but then we share all those records across the registry. So you can go to any one of them and do a search and find anything from anywhere. That's the idea. And so I'll highlight, if I could, the possibility of bringing up a deployment in the UK at RAL, and one of the motivations, and been talking to Brian Matthews about this, and one of the motivations there is that their facility already had kind of some registry service that they already operated, and they were interested in sort of finding a new application platform for that, and they looked at the registry implementation that is part of this, that came out of this work, and thought it could be, not only could they share their own resources through that platform, but also expose their users to what else is out there in the world. So that would be the motivation for bringing up a new node. And so we have people at NIST who are happy to help anyone install and operate the software if they would like to give that a whirl. And Chandler Becker at NIST also continues to do outreach to the material science community. She's basically our liaison to data providers, helping people to add new descriptions into the registry. And there's a variety of avenues that we can support for getting those descriptions in. And the software implementation continues to evolve. Recent versions have expanded the support for PIDs, and we are now trying to leverage that to do linking between records so that you can, have a clear understanding of what organizations support what services, and what service or what resources and what services are associated with which projects and so forth. And we continue to evolve the schema as well. I reported last time that we added this support for the semantic asset resource type, and further evolution may well come out of the new deployment at RAL, as they have some other kinds of resources that are sort of next to the material science field, if you will, maybe from the chemistry area, and that some tweaks to either the vocabulary, the schema, might actually help provide richer descriptions of those resources. So we expect that to continue going forward. And we've also been, talking about how we can just make the presence of the schema more and its evolution more transparent to the community, and allow for participation in that evolution. Further prototyping and use of and expansion of the registry is expected under the context of MARTA. There's a lot of interesting things going on that we'll hear about, where a registry like this could play a role. And so we're sort of seeing how the working groups that are beginning to coalesce under that umbrella, and to see what kinds of motions the community wants to make to further aid data discovery. So that's a very quick summary, and so I can take some questions. And I see one from David that says, "What's the bar for deciding if one should run an instance of the registry? We had a version of the registry up 2 years ago, but it's unclear if it was valuable for us to revive that." So the way I usually answer this question is that if you only have a few resources yourself that you want to share, and by few I mean say 10 or fewer, then it's certainly not necessary to run your own registry to support that. You can just visit one of the existing ones, get an account, and start creating records through the interface. Or you can contact us, and we can, work with you to sort of curate with you, if you wish, if you prefer, records to be added. However, if you are a data center that has quite a number of resources, and maybe those resources, are continually evolve, it may be useful to run your own registry. And the reason for that is that you could use the programmatic interface of the registry to tie it into your own metadata management system. And you might find that more convenient to keeping your records up to date. But not only that, if you are a data center of some sort where you provide many resources and you have a user base, you might find it useful to provide for that user base exposure to other resources out there in the world, and that could be done through a registry like that. And there's another question here: can groups support a specification OAI such as OAI PMH and join the federation? Absolutely. So you could either consume records from the registry by using the OAI PMH to harvest records out of it. That's encouraged. Or you can, the registry can pull in records from you, provided that you can support an output format that is the format that our registry
That's great,
uses.
Ray. Maybe we should end there. And if there are other questions, people can get in touch with you, or we'll have the transcript and be able to relay those to you.
Yeah. Plus, there appears to be a way that I can answer questions in the Q&A area.
Excellent.
So I will attempt to do that as well.
So we'll thank Ray again for that great, and move on now to Bob Hainish, who's going to be talking about the research data format. So Bob, are you here?
I am here.
All right.
Change my camera. So I'm looking at you instead. It doesn't want to change my camera. Sorry about this. Okay. I don't have, I could pull up a slide deck, but let me just briefly tell you this. It's the research data framework. And what we are doing at NIST is trying to develop, with community input and community consensus, an overview, a guideline, a roadmap to who are the players in the research data ecosystem. We have universities, we have government agencies, we have publishers, we have professional societies, we have data repositories and data service providers. All are playing some role in the management and dissemination of research data. But it's a little bit confusing to figure out just who is doing what, with what resources, with what particular services. We have organizations such as RDA that bring together, the thousands of people who are members of RDA to discuss best practices and make recommendations about research data management. We have CODATA, we have the World Data System, we have GoFair, and we have national and international committees. For example, under the Office of Science and Technology Policy, there's the Subcommittee on Open Science. There is the incentives for data sharing under the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine. So there are many, many entities that are engaged in the research data ecosystem. What we at NIST are starting to do is to run 2 pilot projects to flesh out what our research data framework should look like. One of them is with a horizontal cohort, including research universities, their libraries, scholarly publishers, professional societies. The other is a vertical in the materials science domain. And what we intend to do is working with organizations such as this interest group, such as the Materials Research Data Alliance, the MARTA, and other organizations that are engaged in research and data management in materials, is put together this framework, which involves envisioning how you do data management, planning for data management, data sharing, data analysis, and ultimately disposition of data. How do you decide how long to keep data and what are the practices for preservation? So basically, I just wanted to make this group aware that this is now starting off. We are in the process at NIST of identifying some people to work with us on sort of year-long detail to help with these 2 pilots. And fortunately, in materials science, there are already many studies that have been done about the challenges facing the materials science community in terms of data management. Some over the past decade, nearly, I think, 30 different studies have been conducted. We will build on those. We're not going to try to start over where good information has already been assembled, but we want to aggregate, integrate, and then identify where there are remaining gaps in the research data infrastructure, and try to help the materials community in particular to close those gaps and to learn from each other on how we can improve data access and interoperability in the context of making data fair. We're also working in conjunction with the new initiative under FAIR for Fair Digital Objects, and we'll certainly be trying to integrate activities there into the framework so that we understand really who are all the players and what are they contributing to the entire research data infrastructure, particularly in the materials area. So that, in a nutshell, is what we are up to. If you are interested in helping us with this, please drop me an email, robert.hanish@nist.gov. I'll make sure that you're not only on our distribution list, but as the pilot project and material spins up, I will gladly reach out to people to have you participate in what we expect will be a series of 3 workshops over the coming year. The first one to sort of orient everybody to what exists. The second one to identify capabilities as well as gaps, and a third one to basically test whether the framework that we have developed helps organizations to properly see themselves within this research data infrastructure and framework. And I think that's really all I had to say, Laura.
Thanks so much. And we have time for a question or two. If people had any specific questions they wanted to ask. Well,
Laura, this is a little off to the side, but Zach, I posted the link again. So if people look in the chat to the Google Doc where people can make comments, and Zach asked if there's a section.
Yeah, and so what Bridget had recommended is that we use the Q&A for questions, the chats for comments, because we will get a transcript of those. And then the Google Docs is really just so that people can identify themselves as being taking part in the session. And that's why it just has lines for names and institution and email. So thanks very much, David, for posting that link for those who came in later. And Bob, thanks so much for giving us that update on the research data format as well, too. And Bob had posted his email for those who would want to follow up with him for further comments. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And I think now we're able to turn to our next speaker, and that'll be David Elbert. He's going to give an extended presentation, and he'll be talking about the Materials Resource, the Materials Research Data Alliance that had a recent meeting, and also a survey that it had run as well too. Jim's also going to be joining him to add comments. So we can see your screen, David. So whenever, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers in this session. So I'll try to be quick. Laura said extended presentation. That scared me, probably scared everybody. And excited to be at RDA and talking. This group, of course, has been meeting outside of plenaries, and so anyone who's been part of that, I can't see the participants list right now when my slides are shared, but you have heard about the new Materials Research Data Alliance, MARTA. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to that and make it kind of brief. It didn't come out of anywhere. MARTA was springboarded out of a summit on big data and cyber infrastructure and materials research that was held in 2019, which of course built on lots of prior efforts, many places, including in the RDA and in the very active NIST group, and really responding to things that came out of the 2017 TMS report on building a materials data infrastructure. So that meeting really focused on identifying ourselves as a community and working on what sort of common ground we had to then move forward. And this was a summary slide from that summit. And really a major outcome was to create the Materials Data Alliance to provide governance for work of building a network between all the stakeholders for materials data. As Laura mentioned, we had our first annual meeting in February, and MARTA really is a community network. It's meant to connect and integrate. Stakeholders really come from all different types. The slide on the right I cribbed from Chuck Ward, who was one of our plenary speakers at the annual meeting, just to highlight, without the specifics of it, the types of different types of data and connections one needs to make. But really our stakeholders go even further than that. It's the people part of the infrastructure that needs to be connected to understand all the different ways that people want to interact with data, whether that's the researchers who are creating data and using data, those who are working on repositories and context for that data, or publishers who want to know how to access data or where it should be in the publishing link, and of course funders, members of industry with more private research infrastructure, and how we connect all of those. So connecting those, making that network is what MARTA is about. And of course, it's always science-driven. So we spent a year really building it, and I'd like to highlight that we had a council to do that, 12 really great people who put a lot of time in every month to work on clarifying the mission of MARTA, creating some bylaws, getting a website off the ground, and then putting together the first meeting. And so these are the folks. So it's Vicky Donwin from Ohio State, Peter Voorhees from Northwestern, Apurva Mehta from Berkeley Labs and Stanford Light Source, Sergey Kalinin from Oak Ridge National Lab, Laura Bartolo, of course, who is here, Ben Blazek from University of Chicago and Glovis, Boris Kaczynski from Harvard, Kate Brinson from Duke, Ian Foster from University of Chicago and Argonne National Lab, Ale Strachan from Purdue, known best in this community perhaps for NanoHub, myself and Eileen Daguerre from the American Ceramic Society. So we really tried to get representation from across the materials domain here, and in our bylaws we actually emphasize that. And we put together a mission and a set of goals, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. There's, of course, a website, martaalliance.org, which I'll show you in a second. But the focus here is really on creating this network to connect and integrate. And initially it was the US materials research data infrastructure, but it's really moved on and become an international organization fairly quickly. Our working groups are starting to coalesce. We have 3 at the moment and discussions to start others. And those working groups already have international participation and in some cases leadership. So we really are working to promote the convergence of ideas and people and data and tools and be a platform for that. We did have our first meeting in February, the 23rd to the 25th in the afternoons. We had excellent attendance at that meeting. We did not widely publicize the meeting and try to go for maximized attendance in the virtual framework. We really, I think Laura was the one who gave us the marching order of leave them wanting more. So over 3 afternoons, we picked out a few things to cover. Really, the first day, we set things up and created the excitement for the organization, what we were trying to do. And in the second day, brought in people working at more the state-of-the-art level for implemented data infrastructure. And then on the third day, moved on towards people and included education themes and the like. Picture on the right is from Krishna Rajan from the University of Buffalo's talk on that third day. The videos of the meeting are not yet posted, but will be posted within the week on the website. I actually want to show you that website really quickly, so I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint slides. So the website is here. It's, as I said, marta-alliance.org. It's still a little bit clunky, but it gives you some basics of what MARTA is if you're not familiar with it. Some about MARTA includes discussion of the mission of MARTA and what we're trying to provide in MARTA. In many ways, MARTA has mimicked the way that RDA works with a focus on working groups and the way we structure those working groups and prioritization that really comes from the grassroots, from the community. So when people want to get together and work on a project, we try to provide the framework to give them working groups on that and let them do it. And the prioritization just comes from people wanting to do it. So again, here's the governing council. We're still working on a new structure that will provide a little better way to actually see what's going on in working groups. One here, the first working group that was really approved is this one, which is put together by Zach Trott, who I'm sure is on the call, Santanu, Marcus, Matthew Jacobson, and Clara and Suhas Somnath from Oak Ridge. So working on provider integration and interoperability. We just added a new working group this week on data dictionaries in materials research. So things are moving along well. If you actually look at the part of the website for the annual meeting, actually the easiest way for me to get there is do this. I showed a screenshot of this, but it has the agenda for the entire meeting, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons. You'll see we had great representation in our speakers from across the domain and really internationally, including those working in industry, not just in academic labs. We had representation from funders as well. Linda Sapacek, who leads the OSTP subcommittee on the US MGI, as well as being the National Science Foundation's DMR division director, kicked us off. And then we had talks also on the first day from the DOE, Department of Energy Office of Science, 3 representatives. So they were quite enthusiastic and have been in contact since. And of course, we had great representation from NIST, helping on a variety of fronts, including Bob and Jim and Chandler and several others. So we really had a pretty lively program and have had a lot of ideas launched within MARTA that go to a depth that's a little bit different than what we think of in RDA, and sort of in a direction that's a little bit different. And so the other thing I want to just talk about briefly is that the same project that funded the summit and organized the summit that led to MARTA also has a survey to try to increase our understanding of MDI, and specifically the sort of human side of MDI in terms of data practice and habits. And so I had promised to come and talk about that a little bit today and report out some of the results. I'll say that we were delayed in launching it for a variety of complex reasons, including reviews from funding agency, NSF, and human research subject boards, the IRBs, that we have to deal with, at least in the US, when we do these types of surveys. We initially envisioned the survey as really surveying materials data infrastructure, mostly nationally in the US. But during the time when we were putting it together, Jimenez and et al.'s great paper came out, and so already did some of that work for the physical infrastructure. So we really retooled and focused more on attitudes and beliefs. It's a subject that has come up in some of our interest group discussions outside of this plenary meeting earlier in the year about, gee, it'd be really good to find out actually what people think about this stuff, and how they, where they think the practitioners think some of the gaps are. And so we have focused on inviting participants into the survey who are research scientists and staff in the US at this point in time with NSF and other government funding. So those that are running materials research facilities and centers, other programs and projects that emphasize materials data research. So we currently are surveying over 600 participants in the National Science Foundation's DIMREF program, which is a principal funding source for MGI projects within NSF DMR. And we see the survey as complementary to existing efforts or established efforts. The survey itself really focuses on a couple of five guiding questions, which are the prevalence of sharing and use of data already in materials research, what these practitioners think are current major impediments to fair data sharing rather than what those who are creating infrastructure think, general attitudes with respect to the use of data in materials research. Are there differences based on the field of expertise? Materials is obviously a very broad field. So we have those who are identified as doing materials research that come from solid state physics, that come from chemistry, that come from engineering backgrounds. Are there differences here? What's the prevalence of data-centric research approaches in materials research? It's interesting already looking at the preliminary results that we have back on how many people think that they are doing data-centric research versus their perceptions of what other people are doing and whether they characterize it as data-centric research. And again, are there differences based on the field of expertise? And then the success of national facilities and centers to meet data goals and needs. Most directors profess feeling pressure from funders to adopt FAIR principles and meet those. But what do the directors see as pressing MDI needs to actually do that? And so the last thing I wanted to bring up today are to talk about how MARTA and RDA complement one another and what's really the best way that these two organizations coexist. All of us here are obviously members of RDA and see this as an extremely valuable thing to do. And in the MARTA, we've tried not to replicate what RDA is doing, but really try to get much broader buy-in and participation from many more material scientists than will ever come into RDA itself proper. So we have goals for membership and activity. Should it be that we're looking to get more material scientists in MARTA, not really stretch that within RDA? I'm curious to know what this interest group thinks and how we build this out. How do MARTA and RDA fit together most effectively? How does MARTA serve the RDA needs? And then how does RDA serve the needs of MARTA? Another question would be, how can MARTA best serve the different needs of the international community? would it be helpful to connect national level efforts, or would it be helpful to do something different, like connect international groups unencumbered by national level structures, or something else entirely? We really initially built up MARDA as a US thing, but since it has pushed on to the international level, there are other efforts that aren't the same internationally. So how do these work together? What gap do we fill there? Another thing to hammer out is that during the time that MARTA was forming, RDA worked to develop something called community of practice sections. Is MARTA a de facto RDA community of practice? If you're not familiar with the community of practice, there's a document that came out in December of 2020. We don't fit all the definitions of an RDA community of practice. First of all, we weren't created within RDA. We were created separately. We are not a subunit of RDA, despite the similarity in names. Should we petition the RDA to accept MARTA as a type of community of practice? Is there something else envisioned here? And finally, something that we grapple with in MARTA a lot is, do we need to fund things versus just organize things? Do we need to actually incentivize things and help fund them? So those are the slides that I had. I actually took that set of questions, and before I understood from Laura that we're not supposed to be taking general notes in the Google Doc, I did actually put those in the Google Doc, so they're at least available if people want to look at them as we discuss. So that's what I had to say, and then Jim, I'm sure, wants to jump in. Jim summarized at the annual meeting, sort of wrapped things up for people a little bit, tried to tie a bow around it, but I'm not sure if he has things he wants to emphasize before we just go to open discussion. We wanted to save most of the time for discussion.
Yeah, so I don't think I need to go on a particular length. I think it would be valuable to somehow figure out a way to put those questions up so that people can look at them. And I think it's because it's going to be, we have a bunch of questions that we really would like to have a conversation around. So my only sort of add, as a Fed and as somebody who's been, involved in the MGI for a long time and been trying to push these ideas of, the need for data infrastructure. Of course, everybody here is already on board with those ideas, so I'm not trying to convince you all, but addressing the incentive problem, which everyone likes to complain about in the general sphere, but if you talk to people already on the inside, like we are, who are already convinced on the need for the data infrastructure, we tend to we get tired of talking about the incentive problem because we're already convinced, right? We don't need motivation, but the rest of the world does. And so one of the reasons that things like the RDA and the MARTA can exist, in my mind, is to try to frame the problem in a way that is actually attractive to the rest of the community. How do we get the rest of the community on board? So instead of just saying, someday you'll be able to cite your data, or some thing out in the future, I really want us to think much more clearly about how we convince people to get on board. How do we show them what's in their self-interest today? And if it's not in their self-interest, how do we get them to explain what it would take for it to be in their self-interest? Once we can get people's self-interest, I think the problems all go away, and then we're solving a whole different set, and we will get there. But I think we really need to attack this that openly and that clearly. And this is a bit different. So I think the MARTA will hopefully have these sort of notions of platforms and roadmaps to get us along this road towards the functioning data infrastructure that generates new science, that generates new research results, and creates real value, easily discernible value for the community. So that would be my only sort of editorializing. So beyond that, I think if we could have a discussion, I see Autumn has put one question or one observation in the chat, which is that it would be great to connect the EMMC, the Materials Modeling Council, although I think the modeling may have been removed in favor of something more generic, which is good. And of course, there are other efforts worldwide that have a similar flavor to the MGI Adam and I have actually talked about creating a sort of global buy-in on MGI concepts as well, whether that fits within the MARTA. I think the MARTA can really bolster these kinds of ideas, and certainly I think you would agree, Dave, that we want, right, as much involvement as internationally as possible in the MARTA, because there's too much to do, right? And this stuff all has to work together. So people have, you know, the desire to make this happen. That's fantastic. One of the problems we're going to have is funding. You know, and I think anybody who's participated in the RDA knows that there are a lot of people who care deeply about these issues, but really don't have much bandwidth outside of the meetings to get the work done that needs to get done. You know, NIST, fortunately, is paid in some sense to do some of these things, and sometimes people will have grants that allow them some freedom to work on these issues. There needs to be more direct funding. So another real potential value of the MARTA, of course, is it gets the community to start clamoring to the funding agencies that this is a prime importance and needs direct funding. And so I'd like to see that happen as well, of course. All right. So I think I'll let you sort of hijack the conversation again. And
well, I was going to jump in on the funding question and say that you know, one thing we learned in the annual meeting that we reinforced, at least, is in the U.S. we have different funders, and those funders have different priorities. All of them have a deep interest in materials data right now, and the drivers for why we care about materials data, which of course is mostly AI and ML right now. And so they're working on things, but it can be very difficult, we find, for our practitioners in the US to please different funders. And funders often like to draw walls around things and say, this is what we have established, and others say, this is what we have done. So the MARTA is already started to help break that down a little bit, and I think that's critical. And of course, it gets much more complicated when we involve funding internationally, where we have, those of us in the US have a lot less knowledge about the nitty-gritty about how that works and the like. But ultimately, I think that is critical, and I think MARTA does have an opportunity to really make some headway there, to bring feedback to the funders who are looking to know the best way to make this happen and change some of their practices if need be, to work together more on things. So, I also think in response to Adam that I would say that one of the things that really separates the RDA and MARTA to me is the type of people that we talk to. I mean, for me, the RDA was a revelation in talking to people who are very data focused and don't necessarily know anything about material science and yet are interested in it. But it's a big gap to then talking to people who are working in labs and want to collect data and want to create a new way to do ML and do something with that data, and don't have time in their career to put into becoming a data person or coming to RDA to do that. And so understanding how to bring outcomes, and I think it's just an opinion, but I think it's one of the things that hinders RDA outcomes from having broad enough impact, or as broad an impact as we would like to see, is jumping across that gap. So I think from the RDA community perspective, the MARTA can create that inroad to help have more impact of what we do. And from the MARTA perspective, it gives us access to people in the RDA who can do things that most of the people in the MARTA are simply not going to do. They hear ontology and they glaze over, you know. So bridging that gap, I think, is a helpful thing too. Then we have to figure out how to do it. So
we've heard from Adam. He's had a couple of nice comments. I think we have only about 5 or 10 more minutes at most. And I know we still have a bunch of presentations, correct, Laura?
5 would be good. 5
minutes. There you have it. So so that's no problem, but the question is, are there specific comments that people have about the questions that Dave listed, or that, you know, I'm trying to quickly read through them all now and try to say, well, is there one that we want real response on. I mean, the thing that I find most interesting is what is the proper relationship between MARTA and the RDA. You know, right now my mind is somehow the RDA is more international. Obviously, it contains experts outside of materials. But you know, what can the RDA do that the MARTA can't, and vice versa, right? What is the purpose of this meeting that we're having today beyond today's meeting? Can the MARTA handle all of that? Should it handle all of that, etc.? I think we probably want to use the RDA, as it were, to maximum benefit. And so I think the right role is some kind of survey of the products that the RDA is generating so that we can take advantage of it in the materials space. And then the MARTA can then harness the RDA in that way, because this group, so perhaps that's the function of this group, right? It's to try to understand what it is that the RDA is doing outside of this group. And then hopefully feed a lot of that down to the MARTA. Plus, there is this extra international sort of global piece to the RDA that, well, someday maybe the MARTA will have it, but right now I think it's more ad hoc. Are there other comments on that front?
So there are some comments in the chat. Gerhard says that RDA should be really useful to coordinate and combine activities and distribute the effort internationally, and also that OntoCommons Europe is funded to work on materials manufacturing resources from an ontological perspective, which is maybe less covered in MARTA, surely vice versa. And Zach also points out that there's also a bit of a clarity problem within RDA, because the materials IG charter, the way we address things here versus chemistry IG and engineering IG, all have very different charters compared to ours. So yeah, there's already a question of what covers what and what is being approached.
So, I mean, Zach,
we don't have a charter, we have a paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I respect the need for process, I don't think so much the charter as us just deciding what to do, if we can put it in the charter or not. And so perhaps the process of generating that would help, you know, make that happen. I don't know. But Zach, that might be something that we would welcome. I would take some leadership there. Then I can take a look at getting that started. Are there other the OntoCommons thing? I saw a presentation about, I think through the EMMC workshop a few weeks ago or months ago, who knows. The ontology thing is very interesting, isn't it? It'd be good to get some kind of report back to the MARTA, or maybe there's interest in forming an ontology group within the MARTA. I don't know. I mean, it's similar to, I think, the thing that
in my experience, ontology workers are always enthusiastic. So I'm sure we could find people to form that group. What I don't want to do is duplicate working groups between the two.
I think that's right.
Trying to figure out what makes a working group within RDA materials and what makes a working group within MARTA, and smoothly knowing how to make that function is ultimately important to us, I think. And I do think that RDA works at, for want of a better description, a higher level in terms of these problems and these data problems, and that MARTA working groups really should have functional, attainable outcomes that are implementable at the lab level and the facility level. So I think those two balance each other, but it won't always be clear. One advantage we have in the MARTA right now is that we are small and nimble, and RDA has a lot of process documents, so we can work with it.
So we're getting a lot of, I think, very wise feedback in the chat. So hopefully that will get captured, and we'll try to strategically respond to those wonderful comments. So I think we'll send this back over to Laura.
And there will be a transcript. That's why we had encouraged people to put things in the chat. There will be a transcript from the meeting, and so we will be able to get back and respond to those as well too. But this has been great. And we thank you both. David, that was a great run through of both MARTA, the meeting, and the survey. Thanks so much. And Jim also encouraging those comments to come on. And so obviously this is something that has good possibilities for the materials community as well as the data community and the combination between those. So at this point, I'd like to hand our meeting off to the last discussion group we have. And so now if Alicia, Matt, and Adam would turn on their videos, they're going to be running a discussion on delivery platforms for open marketplaces. Before I turn over to them, I'm going to again put in the chat the link to the Google Docs. It's simply to allow you to identify yourself and your institution and email if you would like. And then if you want to have comments, please add them to the chat here and questions into the Q&A. So thanks so much for you three taking over.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah. Can we all just check our microphones are working, I guess? I can hear you, Adam.
Yeah.
Yes, this is me.
Great. Okay, and hopefully you should be able to see the title screen as well, and I see some thumbs up. So, okay, well, I just thought I'd briefly introduce then this sort of session. So we were given this vague title of delivery platforms for open marketplaces, and I think we've even broadened that and made it more vague with our presentations. But what we're going to broadly talk about are some perspectives from simulation, from sort of community building aspects, and from infrastructure. And yeah, we've got Adam and Militia here to sort of introduce themselves and give some slides. So I think Adam, you're starting first. So if you want me to sort of click through, just give me a shout, but I'll try and keep up otherwise.
All right, thanks very much. So let's get on it. So the first part is about delivery platforms for open marketplaces and looking at the simulation perspective. I think we already mentioned the EMC a number of times in the previous discussion, which was really nice and great. And so maybe I just say it up front, the EMC and or vice versa, the MARTA seems to be taking steps that are in the direction also of the EMC, which is really fantastic. And I'm sure we can learn from each other's experiences and also others all around. And there are lots of opportunities for us to really look forward to collaboration as something should be nice. So currently I'm a member of the board of directors of the EMC, and also I want to mention the digitalization and marketplaces focus area, which would be the contact point for discussions related to data and digitalization in the EMC, as well as also directing discussions as proper to the Onto Commons, which Gerhard mentioned earlier. I'm also a director of the Materially, which is a startup just founded for creating a materials development marketplace. So if you can go next, please. So the goal is to create, I think this covers the whole domain, is to create kind of collaborative, digitalized, open digitalized workflows that integrate materials modeling and characterization, in a sense, also as kind of fair resources. Matthew, please keep clicking. I think it would be much easier. So the thing is that you'd be able to really pick up whatever resources you need and put them together in order to create something really new and not really have to reinvent the wheel every time. And this brings up questions like, how do you integrate different simulations and characterization aspects and platforms together? So we need to develop this kind of integration infrastructure, not only for data, but also of how the services that will use this data. And this brings up this concept of the materials modeling / development in general. Marketplaces, we call it a marketplace because it's a place where you can really pick whatever components you want and put them together and reuse them in all sorts of different ways. And this just goes much beyond just data and simulation, but there are many more components. Next, please. Next. So these components comprise, for instance, various knowledge aspects, knowledge, expertise, and experts. Who is responsible for what and who can do what, and so on. Types of applications, integrated or existing modeling workflows, and simulation platforms or data platforms themselves can also be integrated together with expertise to generate, to enable first of all rapid discovery of what already exists. identify gaps, work collaboratively to fill up these gaps, and make seamless collaboration and create new advanced workflows and, in a sense, enhance the innovation cycle. The EMC activities, in particular, directed towards getting funding, were pretty good in the last years, I have to say, in the European level, and we have at least 3 major marketplace projects that are being developed: the VIMP and the marketplace project, which I coordinated until recently, and until while I was at the Fraunhofer, and then I went on to make my own startup. And then there's also partner in the new DOME 4.0 digital open marketplace, which an ecosystem, which is a new project. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But these are activities that we've been involved in the EMC, and it would be really nice to see how they can resonate with future activities, both on the industry level, and also on MARTA and other kind of activities in the Material Genome Initiative, etc. Next, please, Matthew. Thanks. So when we try to integrate all sorts of aspects and all sorts of tools and resources, the first question that comes up is interoperability in practice and how we achieve that. So you can talk about many forms of connectivity, one-to-many, many-to-many. I think in one of the sessions earlier this morning about the microstructure, there was some discussion about the fact that you have many different conversions you have to make to different tools. Maybe it was even in this session, if I remember correctly. But there's many different ways to connect different things and achieve different levels of interoperability. Can you please click again? I think there's something missing in this image. Yeah. So what we need at the end of the day is to agree on some kind of a common representation system, and it would be great to make that based on ontology, because they can solve a lot of technical issues. But there's a lot of finesse here on how you really choose your ontology framework. What is the scope of that ontology? And you don't want to, I will use this expression, ontologize your interfaces to death. It makes them completely impractical to use, but you want to choose the balance between practicality and the ease of use. So this is something we really need to collaborate on. And if we are going to create some kind of international or collaboration on ontologies in MARTA, and it's really nice, it would be fantastic if we collaborate on that as well through the EMC and the Onto Commons, just to pick up on this point of creating the right balance of ontologies. Next, please. So just a little bit about the EMC. It aims to really collate various aspects of resources, of expertise, collaboration, and it's directed towards material science in general. The initial focus, as Jim mentioned earlier, was on materials modeling, but currently we are venturing into characterization and other aspects. So it's much more general than just materials modeling. So you can think of the digitalization in a sense, which goes beyond modeling, is really a central part. I'll just say a couple of words here. You have the link there for the EMC. So we started as a very, very informal association of European stakeholders, and we went into a European project, and then now we are a non-for-profit organization that is trying to push forward the kind of collaborative actions. And there's, again, we cannot really emphasize this enough, there's a lot of resonance with what been shown earlier with MARTA, and I think that would be a fantastic opportunity to collaborate somehow. Next, please. So if we look at interoperability and integration, we have been promoting this since a few years in the EMC. And in short, we can always talk about systems where you create, like on the lower left corner there, like ad hoc compatibility systems, where you make one system talk to the other, but that's it. Then every time you add 2 more systems, there's a lot of overhead to do that. But you can always try to kind of streamline this. You can add some metadata schemas and talk about all sorts of schemes, but they are always just a little bit more at the same time cumbersome, but also a little bit more efficient. So at the end of the day, you really need something much more efficient. And to do that, you can only achieve it if you have a system that have self-contained some kind of logic within it. And that's what we can achieve with ontologies. And therefore, we've been promoting a lot cross-domain interoperability between different domains in material science, modeling and characterization and manufacturing. And also it could be used to cross-domain in the sense of, European, Japanese, Korean, American, etc. kind of activities. So that's really a nice initiative to pick up on. And a lot of this ontology work is ongoing within the EMO concept, European Material Modeling Ontology, and maybe it can be generalized to something more international, but it is already gathering a lot of momentum as one piece of the overall puzzle of ontologies needed. And you can find more information about that in the Onto Commons website. The next, please. So finally, just one more point is that there's this, marketplaces, the next generation. We're taking whatever exists in Europe and in the world and trying to communicate, to agglomerate that into a new system that is a lightweight agglomeration of existing platforms. We're going in various stages, connecting things internally. We call it the interoperability first of all, and then we want to go, if you click again, please, Matthew, twice, I think more, then we're going out to the interoperability, and that's again something that could be of interest for collaboration. This is a very new project, which I'm also involved in, and others as well. You can see the website there, dom4.0.eu. The next slide, please. So finally, there are some potential discussion topics, which I'll mention them now, and we will at the end discuss them all together, because also Matthew and Alicia have their own, have added some other aspects to the discussion. So one of the questions is, what are the challenges and opportunities for global collaborations? We've touched a few of these points earlier, which is really fantastic. But how can we really turn words into actions? And I think the RDA is an excellent framework to do that. What role can industry play in open digitalization marketplaces? We're always talking about open providing data, but somehow this all has to be sustainable. And from the different startup perspective, different company perspective, how can this become sustainable, and how can we really do it? The other question, which is really important, is what are the hardware and software infrastructure needs, especially for global collective collaborations? It's always nice to talk, and it's all fantastic to see that we all agree on most issues. We know that we have common challenges, but at the end of the day, when we want to put that into action, we kind of get into small silos again, even though we are fighting these silos, and we are always kind of free, and forced to reinvent the wheel, and that's something that I think all of us agree is not the great thing to do. So we need to think about how we attack this, and I think that's my part for now. So I'll move on to you, Matthew. My screen is frozen, so I hope you can still hear me. So we move to Alicia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Garmalevich, and I'll be following on from Adam, specifically focusing on a community perspective of open platform development for digital, for biomaterial data. So I am a professor at the University of Santiago in Chile. My focus is on circular economy more broadly, so looking at sustainable materials, mostly in the plastic space. And I'm also co-founder of Materium, which is an open data platform on biomaterial data. Biomaterials in our context, meaning those sourced from renewable sources of biomass that can be readily biodegraded after end of life. And what we're trying to do in this space is stimulate innovation in terms of provide a data layer to enable more people in more places to enter the market and commercialize alternatives to today's polluting plastics. And in terms of the communities that we're engaging with, one is the research community to both aggregate and provide data in the space that's actually quite siloed in different research domains. Two, to engage with researchers as well as community fabricators in digital fabrication workspaces such as Fab Labs and makerspaces to run more low-cost experimentation on materials and provide data. So we're working with open source instrumentation as a lever point to enable a wider community to engage in materials development. And the third community is the kind of commercial space where we're looking at users of the data being startups and folks in industry who are interested in diversifying or getting into the bioplastics market space or becoming new market entrants at a kind of small scale startup. And the open source aspect of it is really trying to democratize access to information about biomaterial formulations and their properties. The idea here is to enable more local and regional players in ecosystems worldwide to be able to tap into diverse and abundant sources of biomass that are around them, rather than looking at kind of silver bullet materials that can be mass manufactured, which is quite problematic from a sourcing perspective in terms of biomass. You can easily over-extract ecosystems. And so we're looking at, sources of biomass that are more distributed, like unavoidable food waste, for instance, agricultural byproducts, this kind of sourcing as the kind of feedstock that we're looking at. So I'm going to, with that preamble, I'm going to focus on a couple of aspects of the data infrastructure. So the second slide, please. So the data model that we're working with captures the inherent relationship between process protocol, which is the recipe, the actual how to make the material, and the process history, or the history of an agent, a user following a specific recipe, and material measurement, and a material measurement data set. So this allows for discovery and optimization of new recipes through hypothesis-driven variations of existing recipes. And that's the kind of core area of innovation on the kind of back-end side, which will allow us to capture information on materials measurement through persistent identifiers. So every measurement taken of a material will have a unique identifier capturing information about the instrument, methodology used, conditions for measurement, etc. And this kind of information is super critical to building confidence in the data contributed by users, specifically from different environments and with a range of instrumentation. So I mentioned open instrumentation, more heterogeneous material developers in not only research labs, but also in startup spaces, community fabrication like Fab Labs, makerspaces. This requires a large amount of thinking and protocols to make sure that the data contributed is actually valid and can be compared with others. So this is the kind of the use of persistent identifiers, and the actual provenance of measurement in this space is really integral to that. And it also will enable best practice in materials measurement to evolve over time as the community learns. So the idea of democratizing, opening access to materials development and measurement also requires education and learning. And so we're looking at integrating tools into our data infrastructure that will allow us to track and understand how material measurement is improving, what are the conditions under which it's going on, what's the instrumentation that is being used, et cetera, and the calibration accordingly, et cetera. So that all of that package of information is going to be integral to understanding how our community evolves over time. Next slide, please. And the other central feature I wanted to touch on just for the presentation today is the process history, which allows us to track previous iterations, and so the genealogy of a recipe. And this is where we're tapping into, we're trying to provide a kind of open source DNA of materials development, or an open source scaffolding for materials development, analogous to forking an open source software. And so it'll enable a community to actually develop a recipe collectively. And so this is one of the core mechanisms we're using to harness that kind of power of open source production as an accelerant of materials innovation. And the principle there as well is that this platform is incentivizing specifically renewable biomass based materials. And so therefore the kind of biopolymers being utilized, cellulose, starch, chitosan, these kind of biopolymers are abundant in many locations all over the world. And so the idea of collectively working and iterating, developing plastics that may be adapted to specific feedstocks, but nonetheless can be collectively developed based on a common material system. That's the kind of idea behind this as well. So the shared kind of ingredient palette that will be used on this platform is integral to that. So that's those are the main features I wanted to touch on for this presentation, and that provides a bit of a jumping off point for the discussion questions that I wanted to bring to this group. The first is, can open source materials development be of benefit to industry innovation? So that's a hypothesis we have at the moment in the sense of putting out some experimental work in this domain, but we're really interested in navigating the interface between open source information on the data side, and then how industry actually works to that. So to give you a teaser in that area, we're looking at working with startups who are going to share failed experiments, for instance, experiments that actually didn't work in their data process or their materials processing, but nonetheless could be very useful to other researchers, other companies, what have you. The second is what mechanisms may allow for collective community materials development. So as I mentioned, we're looking at a lot of that kind of data infrastructure as being an enabler, but that's very much a starting point for us. And we'd love to hear and work with potential other ideas and iterate the ones we have further. And then third, what are the challenges and opportunities of integrating open source instrumentation? And again, that's about data reliability, calibration, et cetera, and understanding how to integrate more heterogeneous users and the data and the environments within which they're measuring materials. So I'll hand it off to Matt on that basis. Thank you very much for the time, and it's a pleasure to again be part of this community.
Can't hear you. I think you have to turn your mic on.
Sorry, I turned it on in one place but not the other. Hopefully you can hear me now. Give me a thumbs up if you can. All I was saying is thank you very much to Elisa and Adam so far. Lovely talks. And I see we've only got about 20 minutes left at the bottom, so I'm going to be quite brief and give a perspective on sort of software infrastructure from a more academic viewpoint, I guess. So I'm currently a postdoc at UC Louvain, and my sort of RDA interactions so far have been mostly to do with the Optimade sort of federation, which I'll briefly describe. Essentially, I think about 15 or so of the leading materials databases focused mostly on computational materials. People hosting crystal structures came together about 4 or 5 years ago and decided they were going to design an API that they could all adopt. And we actually did this. So we released version 1 last July and have finally got a preprint out on archive. If you're interested, the link is at the top there. And essentially, we now have a unified way to filter and to sort of receive responses from lots of these big sort of popular databases in a unified format. And this was a hell of a lot of effort, right? This took 5 years. It was workshop every year, monthly meetings, just with a relatively small, fairly homogeneous set of data providers. And I think, yes, some of the sort of lessons we learned from that could be more widely applied in the community. So we have this sort of federated list of providers and then machine readable schemas and things on GitHub if you're interested. And you can kind of view this as a marketplace, right? As a sort of a data marketplace of different tools where, we've come together, we've said, sort of irrespective of the actual context of our crystal structures, you can at least access them openly using the same, developed clients and so on. And my main focus on this has actually been developing the infrastructure in kind of a modular way, such that, so for example, the materials project uses my code or our code to run their Optimade API, as does the materials cloud. And this kind of comes into my discussion topics of, what kind of collective infrastructure, both in software and hardware, could, the RDA and MARTA, could they sort of motivate or even, provide a place for people to contribute to this infrastructure to lower the barrier for sellers in this marketplace? So I think a lot of small research groups don't have the resources to sort of contemplate projects like this. But if there was a tool, as we've sort of been discussing in Optimade, that you just bring a JSON file of your data and it turns that somehow into an API that doesn't even need to be run on a server somewhere, it can just be sort of in the cloud. Do we want to start thinking about providing those kind of tools to allow more people to sort of get involved? And there's lots of ideas of how you make this sort of scalable, how you make these things discoverable. Do you need to even have some sort of shared content delivery network so that, for example, all the traffic that's going to materials project doesn't hammer some poor desktop computer under someone's desk somewhere? But this idea of promoting these kind of modular approaches to infrastructure as well as sort of data schemas and so on. And hopefully this would lift some burden from early career researchers. So a lot of those databases that I just talked about, so certainly the OQMD and AFlow and things like this, they are developed by PhD students who have other things to do, and they may not be experts in this when they sort of start. And although it's been a good experience for me, I guess, to get involved in this kind of thing, there's certainly places where the barrier could be lowered in that respect as well. So linking up these early career researchers who probably don't know each other at all through initiatives like MARTA and RDA, I think would be really helpful. And again, synergy with these bigger projects that sort of feel so far above the individual researcher that it's it's not even worth engaging with them. So I mean, I don't know what the European Science Cloud, Open Science Cloud is really, but I went to a 2-hour talk on it. I didn't see what it was there for me. Lots of these sort of, for example, Onto Commons we've heard about, and there's lots of other Commons related projects. How do we get the engagement with the sort of the people on the front line who want to be doing this kind of thing, but either don't have the expertise or the time? And then just generally sort of how, what we decide with this infrastructure can really sort of shape the landscape, right? If you suddenly make it possible for people to easily just provide, some kind of JSON file that's been prepared in such a way that it's can be validated and cross-referenced against some other schema, and that just turns into an API. How do we then have this kind of really loose federation of data providers? And what would that mean for what we can actually do with the data, I think is an interesting discussion. So this kind of idea of going beyond just sort of curated archives, do we want to even move to a scenario where you have many small but very specialized sort of data providers? So I think that's my 5 minutes. So what I've just briefly done is sort of summarize these questions. Well, I've just copied these questions from the other 3 presentations to have on a final slide to sort of keep up during the discussions. But I think it would be great if if anyone has a comment about any of these, just sort of dive in. This is now completely unstructured for the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I guess, until we get told to stop.
And so maybe Adam, if you can also turn on your screen to join the discussion.
Well, in lieu of Adam, I guess, I could start, and I have a question sort of for you, Alicia, actually. So when you were talking about this kind of idea of like forking and recipes being developed collaboratively, how do you sort of begin to think about licensing these kind of things? Like if a company wants to come along and say, we're going to now make this recipe and sell it, can you GPL a recipe, or is it always going to be sort of open by design?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this is certainly open area for kind of innovation interpretation. There's no kind of playbook as of yet. So we'd like, if anyone wants to talk about this further as to potential ideas, I would love it. The kind of working hypotheses, right, what we have right now are, first of all, the base recipes that are developed within a community will be open source, and there's a couple of ways we can protect that. One is you can log those as basically prior art. So we can kind of what's it called? We can submit those to a kind of to a collective. I can't remember the repository now off the top of my head, but it's associated with the U.S. Patent Office. But anyways, the point being is that you can actually log those as prior art to make sure that it's searchable, and you at least have a DOI that you can showcase, and that will be on Materium, but you can also use other repositories as kind of extra backstop for that. But that doesn't mean to say that a material that's developed collectively within any given community can be then iterated further for a specific type of processing work stream for a company or what have you, and iterated further, and then commercialized and either under a trade secret or a patent. So it's not to say that there's a sort of barrier to the utility of the data in the commercial space being used in a kind of with patents associated, but rather the base recipes that are developed by a community of researchers or people that are allied with an open source mentality, that information will have the identifiers associated with it so that people can continue to use that recipe, and it's not wouldn't go counter to any patents associated with it. So as you can see, this is a space that needs firming up, but these are the kind of working thoughts that we have in the area so far. I'll find the strategy that we developed. It was quite a few months ago, so I need to remember.
I think we have a question from a cat, maybe.
There are a series of questions that are starting to develop in the Q&A. One I had on Alicia, I love this idea of open sourcing things. I think it's really cool, but in a field that really focuses on monetizing things, I wondered if you thought in software, when things are open sourced, there has to be a way to support the people who are actually doing that work then in an equivalent way. And it's a complex thing in software, and a lot of companies then let people develop some of the things that are needed in open source, but then they will keep certain parts of it private that they can do. But I don't know if you thought about those types of options, or if we should develop a different type of model than what happens in software.
It's something that I think is it would be very good to learn more from that perspective. And I think one of the main question we have is what can be transferred from the software domain and what needs to be altered. So I would suggest that as a basic working principle, that would be where we would start. What I was referring to before is the prior arts archive. So we've been looking at that as one particular way in which you can submit a recipe, etc. But the kind of collective development and forking gets into, all the variations that you could imagine being iterated, both, on the computational side as well as through physical formulations. It really needs to be, there really needs to be development in that space. So yeah, I'd love to talk with anyone who wants to, who has ideas in order to make it more concrete.
Maybe if I can, sorry, first of all, I had to rejoin because I couldn't really open my mic at the beginning. A small comment on this as well about with the same question, at least, and also with respect to the overall scope of things. We could also think about what is the question for the what is the product, or what is it actually that we want to put in? What is the added value that we can get? Is it the let's say one asset, one data resource, or one data asset that then or one application or one program that you can reuse all the time, or is it the new knowledge that we can gain by collaboration? In other words, isn't the collaboration itself the product that we want to aim and we want to get back the feedback for? And it doesn't really matter if there's peer knowledge or not. In fact, this is only just the fuel of the future innovation, this thing which is the most important added value that we can get from all of these platforms, from the Optomatic platforms, from the Material Genome Initiative that was mentioned earlier, from the EMC marketplaces, and so on. What do you think about that? Maybe that is like this, let's say, more the common innovation workflow itself is the main asset. So if you want to have an open source platform, right, maybe we should not really think about the monetary values of the actual source codes or the recipes, but actually it's what you can get on top of them, which drives innovation to the future.
I think that's a good point, Adam. And I also wanted to come in on the various parts that could be opened or not. And for instance, there's the element of processing technology that's also, there's a large open hardware community that is also very adjacent in this space. And so looking at open hardware for materials development is very interesting, but that may be somewhere where a community that's interested in more the commercial space might want to protect under IP specific processing technologies that allow them to take a recipe and actually customize it for a particular application. And then the material instrumentation is also an area where we're also innovating on the kind of openness aspect of it. But I would say at a basic level, the kind of openness in terms of formulation and their properties is really important from the perspective of collaboration that you mentioned, Adam. So when you have information on what the material is made of and what it can do, the bet that we're making is that will inspire more people in more places to innovate on the hardware, to test it out and iterate it within their specific workflows. But at least it's a point to start with, and it's something that will provide a direction of travel for that R&D and accelerate it by virtue of that. But there's plenty of kind of parts of the ecosystem that could be open or closed as a kind of complement to that.
I'd like to also just real quickly before we end the session, Matt had brought up this notion of linking early career scientists, giving them the opportunity to get involved when in fact they're really, because of time and because of commitments, difficult to do. And there were some comments about what are some ways that groups like MARTA and RDA could really help in this way. What do you think, Matt? And also, obviously, our other speakers.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, part of the problem is I think a lot of people in this sort of sphere don't want to self-identify as sort of data management people. They still see themselves as scientists, and they almost see the data management as, oh, this is what my boss is telling me to do, and I can see the understanding, but I don't want to spend my life doing this. So I think you kind of have to offer them something, and I'm not sure what the RDA could offer apart from sort of a conference. MARTA potentially, I mean, or at least organizations on the sort of more field-specific level, and then maybe going deeper to things like Optimade. What we've been doing is just actively reaching out to people who are writing the papers. Right? So if we see that someone has published a database, we send them an email and say, you may not have heard of us, this is Optimade, come to the next workshop, it's free, you don't have to stay the whole time. So offering them like a really, again, all about lowering this barrier, right? It's offering them something that basically doesn't cost them anything and could give them even a small benefit. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what ideas other people have for what you could do within the RDA, because I don't really know.
I don't have a specific focus within the RDA, but it's something that we're playing with, which is developing instrumentation that directly is integrated into the platform and open sourcing that, with the idea being more people in more places start making machines that are interacting directly and providing data in a kind of continuous stream when experimentation is being done. And I don't know what the place, that would be a really interesting discussion, I think, to have within the RDA to understand that kind of development approach. But that's at least one barrier that we're thinking of tackling through the kind of hardware side.
Great.
Maybe from the, I could add that it would be very beneficial for early career scientists to register, for example, to the digitalization focus area in the EMC, which is totally free, and that would link them directly to all sorts of aspects, and maybe also collaborations with the MARTA that has been mentioned a few times as well, which is also free, as Robert mentioned. I think Robert or David mentioned earlier in one of the chat. I'm sorry if I mixed up, but that these kind of things would be really interesting. And if we get these things working, and potential also with similar actions, maybe elsewhere in the world as well, would be really nice. And getting all of the young researchers interacting on equal basis with not so young researchers anymore, let's say, experience, that would be really, really key, because this is an emerging topic, and questions like, hey, I don't want to close my source code or my data and then just charge people money, which is a very traditional kind of business model, but actually create new knowledge. And I'm confident enough, I'm saying in general, like not myself, but just in general attitude, confident enough that will be a continuous stream of new innovations that's going to move us forward. And that's also avenues for exploitation, and that would be probably the thing to do right now. Is just go to the EMC website. Maybe also I'll make a free advertisement to the MARTA or to the MARTA website, and register in both and the RDA, and let's interact, and Optimade as well. Matthew, I did not forget you. I'm sorry, Alicia, but maybe you have also a website that we can register to, then it would be nice as well.
So I'd like to thank our three speakers. This was a great discussion, and we have had some good comments. And if you wanted to have time to look at them afterwards to be able to respond, that also would be great. And I'm hoping Jim Warren might be able to come. We have just a few minutes left to close out the session. And there he is.
You sprung it on me.
We talked about
see if I'm paying attention.
this.
Well, no, obviously the conversation was fantastic. Everybody's very thoughtful. There's an awful lot to follow up on here. So I think the most important thing to take away from that is that we will try to process everything that's been said, both in the chat and in the talks, and try to figure out the best way forward for this group. That could include thinking about, the charter itself. But regardless, we need to formalize, what this group wants to do, how it relates to the MARTA, and the sort of ideas that we were hearing in the marketplaces for sort of, where we're going to get the most traction with the sort of organizations that can support these things and vice versa. So, I mean, I don't, know exactly how we're going to do it. I'm going to be leaning on all of the chairs and many of the rest of you to try to sort that out as we go forward. So I look forward to an interesting conversation. Over.